Good evening and welcome. Welcome to the second session for the book club on Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World, written by Maryanne Wolf. We're very excited to be here and we hope you are too. Reader Come Home is a book that is structured in the form of letters, as Maryanne Wolf looks at what happens to the human brain when we read and how we can nurture the practice of deep reading in an age of digital distraction. Our speaker today invites us to help children be readers, deep readers, by first reflecting on the times we live in. How often do we stop to think that over the last 10 years, we have changed in how much we read, how we read, what we read, and why we read? Do you find yourself facing the TLDR wall, the too long didn't read wall? Do you find yourself reading the same passage over and over to understand its meaning? Do you suspect that when you write, your ability to express your thoughts has diminished? Are you a reader? Were you ever one? Do you have books that have largely formed who you are and what you think? Why do you read? Why do you want your children to read? Let's face some of those realities and then consider how to grow a reader in the digital age. In a culture where the principal requirement is becoming speed, immediacy, and multitasking, why do we need to balance physical and digital reading in the first place? How can we balance it? What are the stages of reading development for children? What might we do from 0 to 2 years, from 3 to 5 years, and from 6 to 10 years? What if by then my child is not a reader? Can he or she still be one? How do we ensure the digital medium doesn't short circuit the growing reading circuit before it happens, before it gets established? How can we be early adopters is always a question to ask of technology, and also ensure that we don't put children in harm's way. Is this balance even possible? So here we are. Before we introduce our speaker, we would like to go over some of the housekeeping rules with the audience. You can ask your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. In fact, if you already have questions ready, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box right away. We will discuss questions around 30 to 40 minutes into the session. If you raise your virtual hand, we would not be able to attend to your question. Hence, we would recommend that you use the Q&A box to share your thoughts or your questions with us. We will be putting up a few polls during the webinar in order to engage with you further and would love for you to participate. We will share the poll results with you either during the Q&A segment or even while the session is on. I'm very excited today to introduce our speaker, children's literature specialist, Katie Day. Welcome, Katie, to the NLF Imaginary Lines Book Club.
Thank you. It is such an honor to be here. And my goodness, that introduction, I'm not sure we're going to have time to cover all those questions, but let's get started.
Thank you. So Katie is an American who has been overseas for over 30 years. She has a master's in children's literature from the UK and teaching and librarian degrees from Australia, earned long distance while living in Asia. Active in international school, teacher and librarian networks, she has been heavily involved in the development and management of the Red Dot Book Awards in Singapore and the Bangkok Book Awards in Thailand. She has also been critical in the Neev Book Awards in India. It's an incredible gift for us to have Katie join us for this session. She loves Reader Come Home, but as a good scientist must do, is also willing to question.
Okay. Yes. Now, the first thing I'll say is that all these slides are available online, so don't worry about taking notes. Whenever I give you a URL to go and read an article, you'll be able to do it later.
I'll leave you to your session, Katie, and join you back in the book.
Okay, thank you. Maryanne Wolf's books are both wonderful, and they both fit into this theme of imaginary lines of this year-long book club. In Proust and the Squid, she looks at the line between oral culture and written culture, as well as the line between the normal reading brain and the dyslexic brain. While in Reader Come Home, she explores the fault line in our current cultural shift from physical print to screen life and how it's affecting our brains. Both books stress what a cultural achievement it is for humans to have learned to read. We are not born to read. Every generation must go through the process of learning the skill. This whole book is a love letter to reading and literature. At the end of letter 3 last week, there was this picture of the brain, which repurposes neural and visual circuits in order to achieve the miracle of deep reading, deep listening, deep thinking, and deep conversation, which build, as Wolf stresses, imagery, empathy, background knowledge, analogy and inference skills, and critical analysis, which he then goes on to explain that internet culture is eroding. These things are totally required for the deep reading, the attention, the memory, the internalized knowledge, and the cognitive patience. If you haven't had a chance to read the book, you can get the gist of her arguments from these 2 articles that were published in The Guardian. She talks of, the summary of her argument really is that skimming is what's killing us. Continuous partial attention is eroding our ability to think. Last week, Aruna mentioned 2 important books which make the very same argument, Nicholas Carr's The Shallows and Cal Newport's Deep Work. Now, deep reading is totally good. However, you can't deep read all the time. So the skill of scanning and skimming is actually necessary. And as a teacher librarian, I like to use this navigation metaphor to explain to kids that they need to learn when to scan, when to skim, and when to deep read. So I say scanning is like getting an aerial view. And this is a picture of Singapore, as that's where I'm living. Skimming is like driving around. You can get an idea of the major neighborhoods, the different areas of the place, and then close reading is walking the streets. But you can't walk everywhere. There just isn't time in life. So you need to be very good at figuring out when you want to scan and skim in order to know what it is you want to read deeply. Maryanne Wolf sees a negative chain effect going on because of our reading on the internet. How much we read, how we read, what we read, and why we read. And she gives a very personal case study of her own attempt to reread a favorite from her youth, Hermann Hesse's Magister Ludi, or The Glass Bead Game. And she talks about how frustrated she was and that it took her 2 weeks to get back that ability to focus and to read the series fiction. Now, this is the point where we're going to do a quick poll to see if this rings true to you. Or do you ever find yourself not able to focus and pay attention to something that you know you could in the past? So we're going to pop up the poll here. So let's just take 60 seconds and answer that, and then we'll get the results on the screen.
Katie, I'm going to end the poll now. Though it's only about 90 of the 124 people have responded, but I'm going to end the poll now.
Okay. And then here we go. Okay, that's I'm impressed that 13% of you have never had the too long didn't read response. And maybe I'm not surprised that the hard print copy is the medium that's preferred. Thank you for participating. Okay, so close that. When Maryanne Wolf talks about this digital chain hypothesis, she uses this phrase that the proliferation of information leads to the gruel-thin eye-bite servings consumed daily by many of us. And she then tells this story, a Native American legend of a grandfather and his grandson. And the grandfather tells his grandson that there are two wolves inside each of us, one filled with hate, one filled with love. And when the young boy says, which one will win? The grandfather says, the one you feed. Now this metaphor of food is very apt when it comes to information, because just like junk food, there is junk information, there's clickbait, highly processed foods. Much of the information on the internet is highly processed. It's not the original source. So the salt, sugar, and fat that we get hooked on and we just keep eating is very appropriate to just sitting on the internet and clicking the buttons. And how we eat, again, fast food, eating on the run, not preparing a proper meal, not sitting down in a chair. So you might have, this is a very recent documentary that's come out and is getting quite a lot of buzz. And it's very relevant because of this thing that it explains how social media is designed for addiction. It is the equivalent of the salt, the sugar, and the fat that we just can't resist. And it's not good for us. What we feed our children is terribly important. Nobody chooses to feed their children junk food all the time. In fact, I have to say that Maryanne Wolf's, all the literature that she mentions in the book, it's just all so wonderful. I kind of joked saying she's like a raw food vegan, as if she never would read anything that wasn't high cultural, highbrow literature. But that's impossible. We just can't get by doing it. It's very difficult to achieve. So Michael Pollan, in his book Food Rules, came up with this nice snazzy thing that eat food, and he means real food, not processed food, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Tim Prusinski is an English teacher here in Singapore, and he wrote this article a few years ago, and I love how he took Michael Pollan's rules and made this book one, read books every day, mostly for pleasure. Now, if we were going to say, based on Maryanne Wolf's book, how would we modify that in any way? So maybe read physical books every day, mostly with other people, sharing with other people is what I would say. I love this article, which came out a year ago, and it argues that when you scan brains, listening is just as valuable as reading. And of course, parents should be reading to their children, and the benefits of reading to one's children is great. I hope you all know Rights of the Reader by Daniel Pennack, and Quentin Blake has done some wonderful posters of it. It's one of my favorite ones. Catherine Rundell is a children's author, and she also wrote this essay about why everyone should read children's books. And Jim Trelease's Read Aloud Handbook first came out in 1979, and the 8th edition was just published in December. And with thinking of the importance of reading to your children, I want to read from Maryanne Wolf's book, where she says, physical pages are the underestimated petri dishes of early childhood. Pages give physical substance to cognitive and linguistic repetition and recurrence, which provide the multiple needed exposures to the images and concepts on those pages, which are the earliest entries in the formation of the child's background knowledge. I want children to experience the physical and temporal there-ness of books before they encounter the always slightly removed, slightly ersatz screen. Now, this man, Stanislas, and I looked it up on the internet how to pronounce this in French. He's a French cognitive scientist that Maryanne Wolf herself quotes. It's Stanislas Dehaene. His book, Reading in the Brain, is a few years old now, but he just came out with a new one, How We Learn, and I highly recommend it if you're at all interested in cognitive science. And he talks about how we as humans, how we learn, it's via shared attention. And that children, when they see where somebody else is looking, it's via the eyes and the fingers pointing. That is how babies learn. And just listening to a book read on a video screen is just completely different. So this is what we need to do. We need to be reading to our children. They need to be sitting on our laps. I started to make this list of what we talk about the affordances. And an affordance, what things can do for us, and what we can do with them. So you can think to yourself, what do you value as an affordance from paper versus what about the screens? The paper, the notion of embodied cognition, the spatial navigation, that you have a much better idea of where in a book something is. You know the length of the book. Just the visibility of books. I would argue, yes, I have a Kindle account and I own many, many books, but I can't see them. I'm not reminded of them. They're out of sight, out of mind. One can get into, I can read paper in the bright daylight, whereas I can read screens in the dead of night, in the dark. The portability, both are portable. You can say books are portable in that they don't need any energy source. You can just carry them around. Screens, okay, the Kindle, the iPad, yes, I can carry around a whole library. Consider an annotation. I put annotation on both sides because I think there are benefits to each medium. Anyway, have a think sometime when you decide how you want to read a book, which medium you're going to use. Personally, I might buy a book on my Kindle because I love the fact I can just press that button, that book is there, or download it from the library. But then if I really like the book, I buy the physical book because then I want it on the shelf, I want to see it, and I want to return to it. Maryanne Wolf doesn't completely reject digital devices. She instead argues that we need to help our children develop a biliterate brain, to be able to code switch effectively, to know when to read in each medium and to read on each medium. And she argues that you should just start with print and then gradually introduce the digital, with that first 5 years versus the next 5 years being a critical point. And parents, when you decide, because you are in control, you're in control of your kids' digital diet as much as you're in control of the food that they eat. So she quotes some experts in her book saying that you must just always consider the child, the content, and the context in making those decisions. Now, if you want some help, there is a very good website out there called Common Sense Media, and they have, again, thousands of age-based reviews, not only of books and apps, but movies, TV shows. And if you haven't come across it, I would say, please go check it out. And when in doubt, consult an expert. Stanislas Dehaene, also in this book, I really liked this quote that he makes about saying the periods of maximum plasticity of early childhood, and the fact that our schools typically teach children to read during the ages of 6 to 8, which is dovetails with the evidence for intense brain plasticity during this time period. He says, we have organized our education system so that it efficiently takes advantage of a sensitive period when the visual cortex is particularly pliable. The brain's plasticity is one of these developments in cognitive science that I find so reassuring. I find it reassuring as an adult that all is not lost. It wasn't just in the first 3 years of life that my brain was set. But it does, for parents, this is something to take very seriously. And Maryanne Wolf makes this argument, the 4th grade represents a Maginot line between learning to read and reading to learn. And when I read that, part of me wanted to be, now I'm a secondary school librarian, teacher librarian, but I used to be in primary school, and it made me think, I wish I could go and teach 4th grade. This is such a critical time. And I wanted to share with you one of my favorite 4th grade teachers. Her name is Ali Quinn. She's at Mr. International School in Bangkok. And I saw her do a presentation to all the 4th graders on reading stories. And she told them, she says, everyone has a reading story. And the reading story is how you came to love or learn to crack the code of reading, or perhaps it's the story of how one book opened up the magic of reading for you. For some people, it can happen in like a flash of lightning with very little effort. But for other people, it can be quite difficult and a struggle, and it can go on for a long time. But in everyone's reading story, she says, or she told them, there will always be three components. There will be the right books, the right people. The right people could be a teacher who perhaps gives you a book to read. It can be your parents. It could be your grandparents who always give you books as gifts. It could be a friend who introduced you to the genre that you came to love. And the clock doesn't just mean the right time. It actually stands for the right context. It's the right time and space. It's having the space to read. It's having people to talk to about your reading in a comfortable environment. So she asks her students to think about their right books, their right people, and the right conditions. And I now, with my secondary school students, I love to introduce the library in this way in the beginning of the year, because this is what I want. I want to know about each and every one of my students. I want to know their reading story. Now, this article came out 2 years ago, and this is interesting because maybe there are people out there who say, well, I'm not a reader. What's going to happen? My child is going to not end up a reader, and what do I do? Well, this article argues that just the presence of books alone can be enough to convey benefits of literacy and numeracy skills. And they looked at age 16, they asked adults, how many books were in your house? And it turns out to be, if there are at least 80, that's sufficient. But if it goes over 350, not you're wasting your money, but it just doesn't have any added benefit. And they say, according to the paper, teenagers with only lower levels of secondary education, but who came from a home filled with books, became as literate, numerate, and technologically apt in adulthood as university graduates who grew up with only a few books. So there's some encouragement. If you even just instill a respect for reading and a respect for scholarly culture, this will have a positive benefit on your child. Here's another hopeful trend, and this was a very big study done in Singapore 2 years ago, interviewing adolescents about how they preferred to read. And it came out that they definitely preferred the paper copies. And I also will say anecdotally, when I give a reading profile survey to all the middle schoolers here in Singapore, the majority will say that they prefer physical books. If you want to read more about the teaching of reading, and especially if you want to get into the whole phonics versus whole language reading wars, which are still going on in the States, I recommend Mark Seidenberg. Like Maryanne Wolf, he's an academic, and he has a wonderful website where he lists a lot of research. And of course, he lists Maryanne Wolf as one of his experts there. So Language at the Speed of Sight, I recommend it. And I was going to end with these inspirational images from Neil Gaiman and Chris Riddell. Chris Riddell was the UK's Children's Laureate a few years ago. And when there was a lot of library closures happening in the UK, he and Neil Gaiman published these in the Guardian newspaper. And I love the opening one here saying, a physical book is like a shark. Sharks are old. There were sharks in the ocean before the dinosaurs. And the reason there are still sharks around is that sharks are better at being sharks than anything else is. And physical books, like sharks, are tough, hard to destroy, bath resistant, solar operated. They feel good in your hand. They are good at being books, and there will always be a place for them. Books are the way that the dead communicate with us, the way that we learn lessons from those who are no longer with us, the way that humanity has built on itself, progressed, made knowledge incremental rather than something that has to be relearned over and over. We need to teach our children to read and to enjoy reading. We need libraries, we need books, we need literate citizens. So I encourage you all, use the libraries at your disposal, buy your children books, and read to your children. And there, if you want these slides, you can take a picture of that URL. And now, Kavita, we can have our conversation or answer questions.
Thank you, Katie. Yes, that was amazing. That was very power-packed digestion of some very heavy letters. Spectacular, simply spectacular. I'm just going to launch one question, which was an important question that that Katie wanted us to ask. Let me just ask that question. It did not come up in our previous poll. Here goes, people. And I think it's one question, so you can manage to answer that in about 30 seconds. Okay, we'll stop there. Popcorn happening really fast. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Stop. And there we go. Are the results, Katie?
Okay. All right.
So
Most people.
30 people that did not respond, 40 people that did not respond, but here are the results. Does that surprise you, Katie?
No, though I think, now I want to go back and look at that previous question we did where people said the too long didn't read, but all right, anecdotally, then we all agree with Maryanne Wolf to a large degree.
Yes, that is interesting, right? Because that question did say that people don't run into the too long didn't read. So it'll be interesting to know why they feel that they have changed as a reader over time. So much to think about. I'm glad we asked both the questions. So thank you so much for that. And let me start with the elephant in the room. We're in the time of COVID-19, and as educators and as parents, everyone's wondering, and the reason we are doing this book club right now is not coincidence. We are doing this for a reason. But a good question to think about, and Katie, I'd love your thoughts on it, is that my child is on the screen all the time right now and needs to be on the screen. So while we can talk about how good it is to read physical books, is that even possible? What is your recommendation? How does a parent or a teacher deal with this fact that children need to be on the screen all the time when we are talking about the fact that we don't want children to be on the screen so much? What do you think?
Well, I mean, obviously, ideally, it would be that you would say to your child, I want to make sure that you spend some hours off the screen and that you're then interacting with a physical book. But I also appreciate that you might not have access to physical books. You might not be able to get into the library. And of course, libraries, I mean, I can go on about how, should we be lending books, touching books? So if your child has to be on the screen, then okay, I would say, can you find them some longer form reading? Because didn't really get into this thing that there's short reading, but then what about dense, complex texts? And yes, you could read Middlemarch on your phone, right? But it's not going to be, I don't think it would be a very good experience, but you still could get completely immersed in the screen. The screen itself is not preventing you from reading. It's maybe distracting you. But the other thing I would say is spend time with humans talking. So if your child has been on the screen all day long, then please sit down with them, talk to them, give them some human interaction. Nobody can survive with just screen interaction.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So should we worry about children who are on screen for their classes? Is that the same thing as being on screen for reading? Should we worry about that?
Well, I would like to think, I'm sure, teachers in schools are trying to make the best of the online learning and trying to make times when you get a chance to speak one-on-one in small groups. So it's not just watching the screen and seeing everybody in a row. No, what can we do? We want our children to be safe. We want our children to be healthy. And I just know that all schools are trying their best to do it the right way. And so this isn't a time to be critical of the schools. This is to say, how can we accommodate and give our children as much human interaction as we can? And when the day comes that we can go back to reading just physical books and getting off the screens, I think schools will probably say we're going to take screen vacations and we won't have devices as prevalent, just to counterbalance what's been happening for the past months.
Right, right. Right. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. So with that, moving into the reading part of it, and so I'm wondering, and you mentioned the skimming and scanning, and my daughter had a word for it when she's now 16, and when she was in grade 2 and we were teaching her skimming and scanning, she used to call it skimming and scamming, not scanning, and scamming. And I'm looking back on that now and I'm wondering about it a bit. But clearly, there are benefits to skimming and scanning, and we need to do it, right? And especially for digital resources to weigh out the benefits of a resource before you start reading it. But then there are also huge benefits to deep reading. Is it two completely different skill sets that we need to bring into classrooms and into homes? How do we balance that, the need to skim and scan and the need to have deep reading?
I think talking about it, and I think giving it a name, it becomes a form of metacognition to have children be aware that there's such a thing as scanning, there's such a thing as skimming, and there's such a thing as deep reading, and to ask them, what % of today did you spend in each one? And why did you choose to skim that article or that book? I will say even for IB diploma students who are doing research for their extended essay, when they come to the library and I might give them a stack of books and I say, you are not going to read all these. You need to be very careful. You read the table of contents, you read the index, you're going to read the introduction and the conclusion, and then you're going to decide if it's worth your time. Is this going to suit your research purpose to read this whole book? Otherwise, they completely despair. They have to try to get a bird's eye view of some books to decide which ones are worth reading line by line.
Right. And we see that with children all the time. But I think, I think the hard thing is that once they learn the skimming and scanning, then they seem to try to do the same thing with books and with deep reading as well, that they try to skim and scan and quickly get information out of it. But I think clearly we need to spend time and balance the time itself that we are spending in schools and in homes to say that let's just do this kind of reading now. So I think there's this whole thinking fast, thinking slow movement. Daniel Kahneman talks about that. Do you see a correlation of that with I'm wondering internal, external bodies of knowledge, thinking fast, thinking slow. Is there a correlation of those two with these two different skill sets? Currently we are obviously in a place where the world demands immediacy and is looking for instant information. So there is a way, obviously, of reaching that quickly. But so is there a thinking fast, thinking slow kind of guidance on this? I'm wondering.
I would comment, I think that there has been in recent times a huge movement towards mindfulness, meditation, there's kind of like a slow food movement, cooking meals slowly rather than driving and getting some takeout food. And this, I was thinking when we were talking about reading fast and there's, speed reading. Have you heard this thing called Blinkist, which would give you like the summary of a book so you don't have to read the whole book, it just gives you the summary? This isn't the same as reading the book and thinking about it. How about people who listen to podcasts? I love podcasts, but some people want to try to get the information in their brain as fast as possible, and you can put your podcast on 1.5 speed, 2.5 speed. But there just is, our human brains do have some limits, and you can't speed read and take in the same information or speed listen. It just doesn't sink in. It has to wash over us. There is a physical limitation to our circuits.
Right. So we just need to balance out all of those skills. It's all sounding like much more work for schools and parents to do though. So we need to get down to taking notes and figuring out how to do this. You mentioned, I just want to switch tracks a little bit from reading here, Katie, and I'm wondering, you mentioned the movie Social Dilemma. And you know, I watched that too, and I thought that was a bit scary because all of those creators of the systems who are now outside of the systems are now talking about the negatives of the system, right, and of the different companies, and they talk about how even email. I'd not thought of that. That even email is addictive, and you know, there's that one person who says, you know, I mean, how quickly are you going to check your phone? Are you? Is basically, I think there might be some children in the audience, so I will not use. But basically, before you get to the, you know, you get to the bathroom and or while you're on the pot, so to say. So it's kind of scary, right? Because it's even email is built to addict you to it, is what the movie makes the case. And I'm wondering that, you know, when we're talking about this whole thing of the slow reading process required for reading and for deepening your reading, but there's this other side, and they all of them talk about persuasive design and how that is meant to pull you. So on one side, this is really hard to do. And on the other side, the attraction is huge to go towards all these apps and platforms. How do we protect our children from this urge? Do we need to protect our children from this urge? I almost wonder, you know, I mean, should we just let them go out and explore and figure it out for themselves? Is there such a thing as, you know, do we really need to help them? You know, we also talk
Yes.
about how the frontal cortex does not actually develop till 25. So it's scary to think that these children, how are they going to develop responsibility with all of this? How do we help? What do we do?
Well, the first thing you do is you become a role model. So just the way that you don't sit down and eat a bag of potato chips for dinner, but you cook something healthy and you sit down at the table and put away devices and show your children this is the way to behave. You can also help your children. There are apps and there are people who in the Social Dilemma movie, they talk about Tristan Harris, and he has an institute in California. I can't think what the name of it is, which is about trying to be healthy of your media. Yes. And ways to resist it.
Humane tech, something humane tech. Yes.
The Center for Humane Technology, maybe that's it. I must say, my own children in their 20s, because they became aware of the addictiveness of the devices, you can turn for your phone. Even the colors on your phone are designed to addict you, to cause you to look at your phone. If you set your phone to black and white, you're less likely to click on something when you glance at it. Yes. You can turn on, I know my own daughter who's 29, she has apps that she locks herself out of, and she will set it maybe for 3 hours, which she cannot do anything except the one app that she is doing on her machine that is her work or what she wants to focus on. So once you become aware of it, just the way that we might know we have bad habits in our eating food, and so you don't buy the food that you're tempted to eat late at night, the chocolate or the salted peanuts or whatever, you just don't have them in the house.
Yes. So that brings me to the question of what makes a good reader. And I'm wondering, you know, that when you read Maryanne Wolf's book, and she talks about the fact that she has an alphabetized shelf where she goes to books that made her, right? And that's wonderful. And I was thinking about what are the books that made me. I don't think it's so easy. I wonder if I'm a good reader, you know, and I'm really, I've always found reading hard. So I feel like I sort of read to save my life more than anything else. And I read a lot, but I read always to save my life. And I can't imagine going back to a book that I've read a long time ago just because it's hard and it takes so much time. Is there such a thing as, it's, you know, I mean, do you have to have an alphabetized shelf to be a good reader? What makes a good reader? I'm wondering if, like, we can think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, can we think of a hierarchy of reading? What would be at the base of the, you know, is there such a thing as a good reader first? And then if there is a good reader, or how do you think of a reader? And what is the hierarchy that we can think of? You know, what comes on the bottom of that triangle, and what comes next, and what comes at the very top that you might or might not be able to get to, and is it okay or not? Sorry, long question.
That is a long question. I would say a good reader, a reader who has the metacognition to know how they're reading and why they're reading, and has a good idea of their own reading story and their own reading history, which might be that there's a shelf of books that have brought great meaning to your life. to even appreciate. You make me want to convince you to reread some book and to see what effect it has on you. And that would be fascinating to listen to how you would metacognitively reflect on that and what you can get from it. A good reader also, and I may be speaking as a librarian, and I think very much in spatial, like navigation metaphors, that I am very aware of authors and books and time periods. And to me, a library it's a three-dimensional object. It's like a city that I can walk through and I recognize, oh, there's that book and I read that when I was that old, or here's a very recent book. And I think good readers who are aware of, it's not just some book comes into their field of vision and they read it. There are connections and you have to make the connections. Books are like people. I do lessons with very, 5-year-olds. You say, how is a book like a person? And there are so many things they can say. A book has a front and a back. Books can speak different languages. Books can be in different conditions, different ages. Books can, it just goes on and on. You'll be amazed at what kids will come up with, because I think books are like dead people. It is like talking to somebody else. But these, when I say these kinds of books, are books written with a narrative. And that's clarify that the benefits of fiction, books that have an argument, books that have a path through them, narrative nonfiction, huge. This is something we're really promoting in schools. Kids think that the nonfiction section is just these information books with little bits of information. Instead of reading a book that has a storyline and tells you, the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks about the development of cancer cells. Anyway, so I would say a good reader is aware of their reading life and their reading history.
Mm-hmm. And would there be a hierarchy? Do you see sort of like regularity of reading as the bottom of that pyramid, and then something else above that? So I'm almost wondering, diversifying and people beat up on this thought process of my child reads a lot of Geronimo Stilton. Should I just stop him from reading Geronimo Stilton? But I almost feel like saying don't give your child Harry Potter in grade 2, but if he's reading Geronimo Stilton and reading a lot of it, so it's fine. It's regularity, but let's try to diversify and sort of, and build further. So I'm wondering, is there a hierarchy in your mind of what needs to be reading?
Well, you would say there's the regularity, and then you get into the fast thinking, slow thinking, that you need reading to be effortless. You need to be automatic. Mm-hmm. So if you read Geronimo Stilton for 6 months and that's all you read, you will get very good, and you will build the vocabulary of that. And I think you will naturally grow out of it and then move on to the next thing. And you shouldn't force kids to move ahead too quickly. If they are comfortable, we also say, checking out books out of the library, there should always be 3 books on your bedside table, and one should be a just right book. A book that challenges you a little bit, it's at your reading level and it makes you think. Then you want a comfort read. You want something you can read right before you go to bed. It doesn't require any thinking. It's maybe a comic book. Maybe it's a book you've read over and over again and you know it by heart. So it takes very little effort. And then you want a challenge book. You want a book that you read it and you think, well, maybe I'm not ready for this book. And so we all need different types of reading at the same time, at these different levels. And so you would move up to maybe, I don't know, does a good reader always reading a challenging book? I'm not sure. I think that going back and the rereading and doing the comfort reading gives enormous benefit.
Right. I know my son is 19 and the last book he read was, this really thick tome, big tome, and India After Gandhi. And then he goes and he reads his campfire comics as well. And, I love that. I love that balance. It scares me when he goes to the campfire comics, but I love it when he goes to the big book, but it's nice to have the balance of both. So, I'd love to ask a question to people at this point of why do they want their child to read? And I think it's important for us to reflect on that before we start thinking of how I want my child to read. Just the question of why do I want my child to read? Can we be honest about that? And I think it's almost, you have to be clear about why you want your child to read before you think about how to get your child to read. So I'm just going to launch a quick poll, and again, one single question for people. Here we are. Again, 30 seconds and we'll stop. 30. And the poll, all right. So there are the results of that. Many people would like, 77% would like their children to be reading for pleasure, but there are also a large number of people that would like them to be reading for knowledge. And we had some honesty there with 3 people saying to make my time easier. Thank you so much for sharing that. On that note, Katie, just one last question for you before I turn it over to Karthika, who's here. So when you're looking at what is your advice to parents? I mean, you've been a librarian for many years and run some fantastic libraries. How do you in your library get children to read more? How do you, you've often spoken about following the eye sort of, and I'm wondering, how do you get them to read more? How do you get children to read what you want them to read, besides what they want to read? So how do you get them to read more? How do you get them to grow as readers? Any advice for teachers? What is the advice you give teachers? What is the advice that you would have for parents?
Practice habit, creating habits, creating a habit of talking about books, creating a habit of always asking kids what they're reading aloud interesting bits. It's just triggering their curiosity until they understand. I think it's a major thing for someone to understand if they've never gotten any benefit out of a book and they don't understand what's going on. When you say getting the kids to read the books you want them to read, I kind of think we really do hope, and I don't even want to say even if it's comics, graphic novels are huge. It's finding, I have a lot of middle school boys that I've been dealing with in the past couple of weeks, and they say to me, no, I don't like to read. And then I go, oh good, I now have a challenge and you and I are going to chat, every lesson, and I'm going to try to figure out what book will open your eyes to that, whether it's about Fortnite, video games, is it about sports? I had a boy today when he said he was into drumming, and I just took him over to the adult section of the library, and he took out a very complex book about drumming. But I thought, at least he's taking a book out, and he will get out of it. Water seeks its own level. He will get something out of it, and then maybe I'll be able to, once he gets to the habit of just taking out books, then get a book that he actually can read all the way through and grasp as a whole. So never give up, never give up.
Thanks. So Karthika, over to you on the questions. I was wondering if you want to start with the question that came from our reader in Ahmedabad who took the trouble to send us the question even before. Would you like to start there?
Absolutely. We have a lot of questions that have come in, but we'll definitely start with a question from Rupa Shah from Ahmedabad. She's asked us a bunch of questions, but we thought we'd highlight these 2. Most Indian schools have 40-minute periods. Within these 40 minutes, teachers are expected to do a variety of tasks and activities. Could this variety of tasks within 40 minutes and change of subjects or content also be a form of environmentally induced attention deficit, which is 1? And another related question, can anything be done to improve working memory, especially of children?
The working memory question, I would say I would go back to some of those books on the brain and learning, and would have to read those. I don't know of anything off the top of my head, but I know that there's a lot of research being done.
Yeah, I'd like to invite people, maybe I'm just thinking, Katie, what if, I'd love to invite Rupa and also our readers to come join us on Saturday morning when we have Maryanne Wolf. Now she is the original reading scientist. So maybe you'd like to join us at that time and we can ask this question to Maryanne.
Yes, absolutely. And I would think I was saying to you earlier, I know, Maryanne, I really want the question on Saturday to be asked too. Is there an age at which deep reading becomes possible, or an age before which they would argue, based on the MRI scans, they don't believe deep reading is happening?
Yes.
I really don't know. I'm anxious to hear what she'll say about that.
Wonderful. We certainly have 2 questions for her. So Rupa, please join us on Sunday morning at 9:30 and all of our other listeners as well. So back to Karthika, the other question on, is it becoming, because of these 40-minute kind of periods, is it becoming an sort of environmentally induced attention? What is the term exactly, Karthika?
Environmentally induced attention deficit.
Attention deficit, because the short chunks of time in which our learning periods happen?
There's a lot of different opinion on that. I've been in some schools where we've gone to 80-minute periods, others 60 minutes, some 40 minutes. I would say 40 minutes is probably the minimum and 60 is better. 90 minutes can be a long time, and especially it just depends on maybe the subject, the age of the children. So that's a good question for schools to address and to do some of the research and become evidence-based practice.
Yes. But as Rupa, you've seen, you've read in the book clearly, because you've sent us your question letter by letter. I love that. And I think in letter 4, letter 5, Maryanne talks also about that, the attention span and all the stimuli that our children are getting, and how it is becoming like a sort of a hyper attentive mode, hyper stimulated. So because of that, many more diagnoses of ADHD as a result of that. Many of those might be physiological conditions, of course, and we have to acknowledge that, but it is environmentally induced as well, possibly by our structures and our quick chopping up of attention times. Yes, Kartika.
We have an interesting question from Shilpa Ganeriwal. People train themselves to read faster using some digital courses and rejoice at reading more books. Is that effective, and how?
Now, and I'm going to think whether in the Duan book, I was definitely, or the Mark Seidenberg book, I think he addresses that. And to say that this, the Evelyn Wood speed reading thing became very popular in the 40s and the 50s, and that no, it doesn't increase comprehension, and it can lessen it, that you aren't getting what you think you're getting. Because you look in the middle and you're trying to increase the span of the words that your brain can take in. And I think there can be a slight improvement, but it's not as if you're missing out. I would not rush out and try to take a speed reading course at all. Right. I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. I'd like to hear Maryanne answer that one as well.
Lots of questions for Maryanne. Thanks for sharing that. I think I agree with you, Katie. I don't think speed reading courses necessarily work. It's really about how to focus your attention better is the only thing that's going to get you faster into reading. But we can ask Maryanne. Yes, Kartika.
We have a question from a parent, Vrishank Anand, who says, how long should we as parents be doing the read aloud or read along? My son, who's 9 years old, is a good listener, but he doesn't want to read for long. So we take turns, like I read a page and he reads the next. So how long?
One's whole life. I would love somebody to read aloud to me. Well, I listen to books on audio, and that's the same thing. I would say I would keep reading aloud, or I like this alternating of the pages, but I would also say 9 is still quite young. Keep going, keep reading. People say even like in high school classrooms, the benefits of teachers reading aloud passages so that you hear intonation, the children you grasp so much more, and that we stop reading aloud way too early.
I think so. I think it's wonderful to invest in that. My 16-year-old she loves to be read aloud too, all the time. And that's reading is a verbal cuddle is what we say, right? So don't you want to give a cuddle even to a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old? Would be lovely. So keep reading.
We have 2 interesting questions on skimming and scanning. Namrata Shetty, how early do you teach skimming and scanning skills in school? And a related question from Seher Khan, is there a logical way to tell whether you should skim and scan?
I didn't hear the last bit of that.
Seher Khan, who asks, is there a logical way to tell whether you should skim and scan?
There's a lesson that I do with, grade 7, and and it's about, we have Where's Wally? Do you know Where's Wally? Where's Waldo? Right? The visual where you have to try to find the little man with the red and white scarf. I then have some sheets which just have numbers, lists and lists of numbers, 4-digit numbers, like years, and then have text. And I tell them, I say, okay, we're going to practice scanning, And some of you are going to be better at finding the pictures. Some of you are going to be better or faster at finding the numbers, and some of you are going to be better at finding the words. So what it will be is you hand out, they have the Where's Wally sheets, they're laminated. They'll be handed a sheet with all the numbers. And then on the board, I would write some numbers and say, find these numbers, and put up your hand the minute you circle this number as many times as you find it on this page. And then certain words, and I'll say, go through this text and scan, don't read, just look for this word and circle it and put your hand up. And then I'll say, we're gonna just see if who's faster, the boys or the girls. And I said, just because today it might be that the boys are gonna be faster at something, or maybe the girls, or maybe there'll be no difference, but that your brains are always changing. And in the end, the one little girl she was the fastest at finding the Where's Wally things. She was way faster. And so I brought her up to the front of the class, and then I said, so how did you do it? What were you doing? And you try to get them to talk about it. Anyway, the teacher later said to me, she goes, that was wonderful. And I said, yeah, it was great fun. She said, no, that child that did the visual scanning best, she is completely dyslexic. And yet she was the winner. She was better. She has she was just at this age, again, it could change. And then the numbers, I said, you'll be scanning for years often, and different kids won each one. And it just shows that our visual circuits, what you recognize, it's not all about recognizing the word, but at least if you can scan, you can get to the page or the place in the text where you now are going to read more carefully. So skimming and scanning, I would love to know what other research is being done on it.
Yeah, I think we at Neev, we start teaching it around grade 2 or grade 3 because it's a requirement to be able to find biases in text, or to be able to prioritize and choose which source of text you're going to use. But we also continue to, in parallel, build the deep reading.
We have time for one last question. And that question comes from Swanand Pagnis. What's a good balance between reading, in brackets consuming, and writing, in brackets producing?
I must say, as a librarian, I do not do many writing lessons. So that is something that I would be curious to hear what other teachers would say. Though taking notes, the very best way to absorb a long, dense text is to try to write it in your own words. And it's not about the highlighting. It's not about the underlining at all. It is about reading, stopping, putting that text away, and with your own brain, trying to summarize what you've just read. So sometimes I joke that we should never take notes, right? You need to make notes. And making notes is such an important skill, and one that needs to be practiced. And it's the best thing for knowing whether you really understand what you've just read.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's all the time we have. Unfortunately, there are a few wonderful questions we won't be able to come to about critical thinking, and there's so many people asking questions about how do they handle deeper reading. I'd love to invite people to come join us at the next session, and I know Katie will be there too in the session attending. I'm hoping we can continue this conversation beyond that. So please keep all your questions coming, and please read, people, please read. So I'd like to close the session today. This is all the time we have. Thank you for joining us, all of you. Thank you, Katie, for taking the time to do this for us, for all of these readers. It's been absolutely wonderful. We have an exciting announcement that everybody who's not noticed the post, Maryanne Wolf is doing a session herself on September 26th from 9:30 to 10:30 a.m. So please join us. It's going to be a fascinating experience, and bring your questions. We're going to make it a much larger Q&A session with her. We hope to see you also for the third session of NLF Imaginary Lines Book Club on September 30th, which is next Wednesday at the same time. We will be joined by Sujata Narona, who's another wonderful librarian. And I want to say that today what Katie did was she went through letters 4, 5, and 6 like we were supposed to, but we also, she also we also asked her to wander a little bit into letters 7 and 8. So if you pick up the book right now, letters 7 and 8 are going to look very familiar to you, and that's wonderful because it's going to make it easier to read. They've been contextualized for you. So even if you're not going to read any other part of the book, please read letters 6, 7, and 8, because those are the ones about growing your child as a reader in this digital age from 0 to 10 is in that period before we go further. So please do read that. Katie, do you have any last final sort of words for our readers before we say bye?
Just thank you very much for having me, and I've enjoyed the questions, and I'm feeling very bad that I didn't have as many answers as you'd like, but it's been just wonderful to consider these things over the past hour. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Have a great evening, people.